Once your HDR grade is finished, it's time to generate Dolby Vision metadata. This is one of the most important steps in the Dolby Vision workflow, and this video will show you how to analyze HDR footage and do an optional target trim pass of your HDR grade, generating L2 or L8 metadata. Dolby's image analysis algorithms do an excellent job for most shots. Often, it's all that's needed to get great-looking downstream outputs for lower-nit HDR and an SDR version of the project. For most content, this is all that's needed. But Dolby Vision provides the tools to adjust or trim the metadata for any shot, giving the colorist shot-by-shot control over the way Dolby Vision adjusts the image when mapped to other targets. To do this, first you analyze shots. Then, while monitoring both the HDR grade and the tone map target grade, the colorist can play down the show and make any adjustments they or their client feels help match the creative intent of the original HDR grade.
So what does this shot analysis actually do? When a shot is analyzed, Dolby's algorithm examines every frame within the shot and characterizes each with a min, mid, and max value. These values represent the tonal range of the image, and they determine how to best tone map the HDR shot down to a much more limited SDR one. So for example, if your HDR grade is mastered at 1000 nits, but an end user is watching it on a TV only capable of 650 nits, what happens? We don't want to just clip the information between 650 and 1000 nits, so the Dolby Vision processing intelligently tone maps the image to the actual playback display, preserving the integrity of the signal at 650 nits from the original 1000 nit master. Doing an HDR grade at the mastering nit level and an SDR trim at the lowest target of 100 nits gives the Dolby Vision processing the information it needs to tone map for any display in between the two. And if you forget to create the 100 nit trim, it will auto-create that metadata for you when you analyze the timeline. But what happens if the automatic analysis doesn't bring the image to where the colorist, or perhaps more importantly, the client wants it? How do you creatively dictate how the Dolby Vision processing tone maps the image?
This is where the trim pass comes in. The Dolby Vision trim tools allow the colorist to go shot by shot and tune the tone mapping to make sure the derived SDR grade and the HDR playback on consumer devices best represents the filmmaker's creative intent. This generates what's called L2 metadata, or if you're using Dolby Vision 4.0, L8 metadata, which represents the final look. Remember, this metadata doesn't change anything in your PQ HDR grade. It just dictates how playback devices map the image to their individual capability. I've already set up my project as discussed in earlier videos and finished my color grade. Now, the first thing I'll do is go into the Dolby Vision palette and select my target display. Dolby strongly suggests always starting with and checking the 100 nit target grade, as it's a requirement for Dolby Vision masters. So we'll start with that. Under Analyze, to analyze the current shot, click Selected. To analyze a group of shots, select them in the timeline by shift-clicking multiple shots and click Selected. To analyze the entire timeline, click All.
Once the analysis completes, the SDR monitor will update to show the tone-mapped image. And if Joey goes ahead and plays down the sequence, the SDR monitor will follow the HDR monitor in real time. And as we watch down the grade, we can start making our creative adjustments.
In Resolve, the trim tools are available both in the Dolby Vision palette and on the hardware grading panel.
So Joey, let's walk through what all these controls do.
On our first shot here, honestly, I think the automatic analysis has done a great job. I wouldn't change anything. But if I wanted to adjust it, there are traditional lift, gamma, gain, and saturation controls. One thing to watch out for, Dolby doesn't recommend using positive lift values to raise the black level of shots. This is because some consumer devices will apply this lift to letterboxed areas, causing letterboxing to look incorrect. Instead, use gain and gamma to add brightness to a shot if needed. On this next shot, overall it looks really good, but I do think it's just a little bit dark. The mid-tone offset control applies an offset to the calculated average picture level. This lets you adjust the overall brightness of the shot quickly without clipping highlights or crushing shadows. If I just dial it back a bit, you can see the shot brightens up nicely. Next, there's the chroma weight control, which is very useful for bright, saturated colors that don't map well into SDR. Because you're mapping from an HDR grade that has way more color volume into a much smaller SDR container, compromises have to be made. While in HDR, it's possible to have very bright and very saturated colors, in SDR, there just isn't enough color volume available for both high brightness and high saturation. What chroma weight does is adjusts what's more important for the image, saturated color or high brightness. For example, in a shot like this, with these super saturated neon signs, we can see the analysis kept the brightness, but the reds aren't as rich as I might want. If I dial in some more chroma weight, it helps to bring out those super saturated reds on the neon signs. Next, let's look at additional controls that are only available in Dolby Vision 4.0. We'll start with the mid-contrast bias, which adjusts the overall contrast of the image, allowing you to add or remove contrast while keeping the white and black points the same. So for example, on this shot, I was going for a softer look. So I'm going to just back off the mid-contrast bias a bit to take out a bit of contrast. Highlight clipping adjusts how much highlights are allowed to clip. For example, on this shot, I really wanted the sky to be bright and poppy. On the HDR grade, that's no problem at all because we have so much more brightness available. But on the SDR grade, I'm willing to let it go into clipping a bit just to brighten up the whole sky. If I dial back the highlight clipping, I can get the sky exactly to where I want. Next up, tone detail. This is a bit like sharpening. It adds localized contrast to higher detail areas. This can be useful because HDR grades appear to the eye very sharp due to their superior contrast. Sometimes that sharpness doesn't always carry over to the SDR target. In a shot like this, all the little details on the Vegas Strip appear very sharp in HDR, but the SDR feels a little soft. I'm just going to dial up the tone detail a bit to add some sharpness to the SDR version to compensate.
In Dolby Vision 4.0, there are additional secondary trim controls which are very useful. You can think of these as targeted trims versus the overall trim controls we just explored.
Switching over to the secondary trims, you can see that we have vector controls for the hue and saturation of individual colors. This can be really useful to narrow down and adjust isolated parts of the image. For example, in this shot, the reds are tracking a bit too orange in the tone-mapped SDR. Adjusting the red hue will let us dial them in exactly where we want them. And in this shot, you can see the blue is a bit weak in the SDR version. I can dial in a bit more teal and blue saturation to compensate.
Now that we're happy with the 100 nit SDR trim, it's also possible to go in and do additional trims for other display targets. For example, if you wanted to see how the tone mapping would look on a 600 nit consumer display and then adjust your trims to that display, you can. Or if you're mastering at a higher target like 2000 or 4000 nits, you may want to specifically do a 1000 nit target as well. While the 100 nit target is usually all you need, you can add as many trim targets as you want.
To add another trim pass, just select a different target display output in the Dolby Vision palette if you're using the internal CMU. I'll choose the 600 nit target. If you're using the eCMU, you'll need to set the target in color management settings as well. You can verify the setting is correct by checking the eCMU status page. Next, choose the target you want to show trim controls for. Again, I'll choose 600 nit. You can then go in and use the same controls to adjust how the image is tone mapped at that specific target. As you select new targets, the iCMU automatically interpolates between existing trims, giving you a baseline starting point. If you make an adjustment, this new target and trim gets saved into the metadata of your final deliverable. Now, if you're doing additional HDR trim passes, you would need to connect the output of your CMU to an HDR monitor, capable of the nit level that you're trimming for.
And how you choose to do these trim passes is really up to you as the colorist. Some colorists will grade a scene in HDR and then switch to dual monitoring and grade the SDR trim for that scene immediately. Other colorists will grade the entire show in HDR first and then do dedicated trim passes. You can work any way you would like. You don't have to analyze the whole timeline. You can select a group of shots and choose to analyze selected instead of all. And if you find a shot that has brightness that heavily varies over time, like police car lights, and doesn't analyze all that well, you can scrub to a hero frame for that shot and choose Analyze Frame. This is useful for shots with flickering lights or dramatically changing lighting conditions. And if you have similar shots, you can also copy and paste analysis and trim data using the controls in the context menu or on the control surface. This is useful for shots like interviews or repeated B-roll. In some systems, like Digital Vision Nucoda, you can animate your primary trim controls with keyframes. Finally, if you're in the middle of analyzing a large selection of shots, you can stop the analysis at any time, and the work is saved and can be picked up later.
So as you've seen, the trim tools allow the colorist to really dive in and control exactly how their HDR grade is tone mapped to various different displays. Making sure the trim pass is as good as possible will ensure that no matter what display the viewer ends up watching on, your original artistic intent is reflected as closely as possible.
So now that we have our HDR grade and all of our trim passes done, we can move on to outputting deliverables. In the next video, we'll explore the different ways of exporting both your Dolby Vision grades and Dolby Vision metadata.